A devoted husband and father from Brooklyn, lived a perfect double life for over a decade, maintaining two complete families in New York and Miami, without either knowing about the other. But when a hurricane forces an unexpected family reunion, what both wives discover in a hotel lobby will shatter everything they believed about love, trust, and the man they thought they knew. Marcus Thompson seemed like the ideal family man. Every morning he kissed his wife Rebecca goodbye at their brownstone in Park Slope, Brooklyn, ruffled the hair of his twin boys, and headed off to what she believed was another demanding business trip. Rebecca had grown accustomed to his frequent travels over their 12 years of marriage. After all, Marcus worked in international finance, and his expertise in Latin American markets meant constant trips to Miami, São Paulo, and Buenos Aires. What Rebecca did not know was that when Marcus arrived in Miami, he transformed into a completely different person. In South Beach, he was not Marcus Thompson, the finance executive. He was Marco Rivera, a successful real estate developer who spoke fluent Spanish and had built a beautiful life with his wife Isabella and their young daughter Sophia. For over 10 years, Marcus had masterfully orchestrated this impossible balancing act. He maintained two homes, two bank accounts, two complete identities, and two families who adored him. To Rebecca and their sons in New York, he was the dependable provider who never missed a soccer game when he was in town. To Isabella and Sophia in Miami, he was the passionate Latin lover who brought home flowers every Friday and danced salsa in their living room. The deception was so complete that neither family questioned his frequent absences. Rebecca believed he was building their financial future through his demanding international work. Isabella thought Marco's real estate business required constant travel to oversee properties across Florida and the Caribbean. Both women trusted him completely, never imagining that their perfect husband was living an entirely separate life just 1,200 miles away. Marcus had convinced himself that he was not hurting anyone. In his twisted logic, he was actually making two families happy instead of one. He provided for both, loved both, and believed he could maintain this delicate balance forever. He had created elaborate systems to keep his two worlds separate. Different phones, different email addresses, different bank accounts, even different accents and mannerisms that he would slip into depending on which identity he was inhabiting. But the human heart is not designed to be split in two, and even the most carefully constructed lies eventually crumble under the weight of their own complexity. Rebecca Thompson had always been proud of her marriage. At 38, she had built what she considered a wonderful life in Brooklyn, with Marcus and their 13-year-old twin boys Daniel and Christopher. She worked as a pediatric nurse at Brooklyn Methodist Hospital, a job that brought her immense satisfaction and allowed her to contribute to their household, while Marcus traveled for work. Their Park Slope brownstone was filled with the comfortable chaos of family life. Soccer cleats by the front door, homework spread across the kitchen table, and photographs covering the refrigerator door. Rebecca had created the kind of warm, stable home she had always dreamed of having. When people asked her about Marcus's frequent travel, she would simply shrug and say that sacrifice was part of building a secure future for their family. Marcus had always been charming and attentive when he was home. He would arrive with gifts for the boys and flowers for Rebecca, full of stories about his business dealings and the exotic places he had visited. He was an engaged father who helped with homework, attended parent-teacher conferences, and coached the boys' Little League team during his off-season. Rebecca never questioned why his work seemed to require so much travel to Miami specifically, or why he was sometimes unreachable for hours at a time during these trips. Meanwhile, 1,500 miles south, in Miami Beach, Isabella Rivera lived in a stunning waterfront condominium with panoramic views of Biscayne Bay. At 34, she was a former dance instructor who had met Marco Rivera at a salsa club 6 years earlier. Their courtship had been passionate and whirlwind, leading to marriage within 8 months and the birth of their daughter Sophia 2 years later. Isabella's life revolved around her small but perfect family. Marco was everything she had ever wanted in a partner. He was romantic, successful, and completely devoted to both her and 4-year-old Sophia. He spoke to her in Spanish, understood her Cuban heritage, and had seamlessly integrated into her extended family. Her parents adored him, and Sophia was clearly the light of his life. What made Marco particularly special in Isabella's eyes was how present he was when he was home. Unlike other successful businessmen she had known, Marco never seemed distracted or stressed. When he walked through their door, he was completely focused on his family. He would sweep Sophia into elaborate hugs, spin Isabella around the kitchen, and fill their home with laughter and music. Isabella did wonder sometimes about the details of his real estate business. Marco was vague about his properties and partners, explaining that he preferred to keep work and family separate. He traveled frequently to oversee developments in Orlando, Tampa, and the Keys, often staying away for several days at a time, but Isabella trusted him completely. Marco had never given her reason to doubt his commitment or his love. The children in both families had grown up accepting their father's absence as normal. Daniel and Christopher Thompson knew their dad worked hard to provide for them, and they cherished the time he spent with them between trips. They bragged to their friends about their father's important job and the interesting places he visited. Similarly, little Sofia Rivera understood that her papi had to travel for work, but she knew he always came back with presents and stories. Both families had adapted their routines around Marcus's schedule. Rebecca managed most of the day-to-day parenting responsibilities, coordinating with Marcus's assistant to plan family activities around his travel calendar. Isabella had likewise structured her life to maximize their time together, often planning special outings and family adventures for when Marco returned from his business trips. The most remarkable aspect of Marcus's deception was how thoroughly he had compartmentalized his two lives. He maintained separate social circles, separate traditions, and even separate personality traits. In New York, he was the analytical finance professional who discussed market trends and investment strategies. In Miami, he was the passionate Latin businessman who spoke with his hands and expressed himself through music and dance. Neither Rebecca nor Isabella had ever had cause to question the man they had married. Both women were intelligent, intuitive, and deeply in love. But Marcus had crafted his deception so carefully that there were no obvious red flags, no glaring inconsistencies that would have triggered suspicion. He was simply a man who traveled frequently for work, remained devoted to his family when he was home, and had built what appeared to be a successful and stable life. The foundation of both families rested on trust, love, and the belief that they knew the man who shared their bed and their dreams. But that foundation was built on quicksand, and eventually, the weight of such an enormous lie would cause everything to collapse. Marcus had developed his system over years of careful planning and execution. He maintained two completely separate identities, with different social security numbers, driver's licenses, and credit histories. The Marcus Thompson identity was legitimate, built on his real birth certificate and early life history. The Marco Rivera identity was an elaborate construction that had taken months to establish through a network of forged documents and carefully planted records. His financial arrangements were equally complex. Marcus worked for a legitimate international finance firm, but he had convinced his employer that his expertise in Latin markets required him to maintain a residence in Miami. The company paid for his apartment, which he had secretly converted into the home he shared with Isabella. Meanwhile, he had established a separate real estate consulting business under the Marco Rivera identity, generating enough legitimate income to support his Miami lifestyle. The logistics of maintaining two families required military precision. Marcus kept detailed calendars tracking both identities, ensuring that Rebecca and Isabella never expected him to be in two places at once. He had developed elaborate cover stories for extended absences, often claiming business emergencies or family obligations that required his immediate attention. Communication was perhaps the most challenging aspect of his deception. Marcus carried two phones, two sets of identification, and even two different wardrobes. His New York wardrobe consisted of conservative business suits and casual American clothing. His Miami wardrobe featured linen shirts, colorful casual wear, and the kind of stylish clothing that fit his Marco Rivera persona. The psychological toll of living two lives was something Marcus had learned to manage, but it required constant vigilance. He had to remember which stories he had told to which family, which friends belonged to which identity, and which version of himself he needed to be at any given moment. He developed different handwriting styles, different accents, and even different body language for each identity. Marcus had also created elaborate backstories for both identities. Rebecca knew him as an only child from Ohio, whose parents had died in a car accident explaining why she had never met his extended family. Isabella knew Marco as the son of immigrants who had returned to Spain, explaining his occasional absences to visit relatives overseas. Both stories were designed to minimize questions about his past, while maximizing sympathy for his supposed family circumstances. The financial cost of maintaining two families was enormous, but Marcus had found ways to make it work. He lived well below his means in both locations, avoiding luxury purchases that might strain his resources. He was careful to provide equally for both families, ensuring that neither Rebecca nor Isabella felt deprived or neglected. Both women believed they were living comfortable middle-class lives supported by their husband's successful career. Technology had made Marcus's deception both easier and more dangerous. He could maintain relationships with both families through video calls and messaging, but he also had to be constantly vigilant about which phone he was using and which identity he was projecting. He had developed elaborate systems for managing his digital footprint, using different email addresses, social media accounts, and even different streaming service profiles for each identity. The emotional complexity of loving two families simultaneously was something Marcus had convinced himself he could handle. He genuinely cared for both Rebecca and Isabella, and he adored all three of his children. In his mind, he was not cheating or deceiving anyone. He was simply a man with an unusually large capacity for love, who had found a way to make multiple people happy. Marcus had even developed different traditions and rituals for each family. With Rebecca and the boys, he was the American dad, who loved baseball and barbecues. With Isabella and Sophia, he was the Latin father who danced in the kitchen and told stories in Spanish. Both versions of himself felt authentic to him, which made the deception easier to maintain over time. The most dangerous aspect of Marcus's double life was his growing confidence in his ability to manage it indefinitely. After 10 years without major incidents, he had begun to believe that he could continue this balancing act forever. He had successfully navigated holidays, birthdays, school events, and family emergencies without either family becoming suspicious. This confidence would ultimately become his downfall. But even the most carefully planned deception has vulnerabilities, and Marcus's elaborate system contained the seeds of its own destruction. The more successful he became at maintaining two lives, the more complex his web of lies became, and complexity, as any mathematician knows, increases the probability of system failure exponentially. The first crack in Marcus's carefully constructed world appeared on a Tuesday morning in September. Hurricane Isabella was approaching the Florida coast, and Miami was under mandatory evacuation orders. Marcus, who was supposed to be in New York with Rebecca and the boys, found himself trapped in Miami with his second family as airports shut down and highways became parking lots. Isabella was frightened by the approaching storm and begged Marco not to leave her and Sophia alone. Marcus found himself in an impossible situation. He had told Rebecca he would be home by Wednesday for Christopher's parent-teacher conference, but he could not abandon Isabella and Sophia during a potentially life-threatening hurricane. Marcus made the decision to stay in Miami, crafting an elaborate lie about being stranded in São Paulo due to airline strikes. He called Rebecca from his Marco phone, disguising his voice and pretending to be calling from Brazil. Rebecca was disappointed but understanding, rescheduling the parent-teacher conference and handling the family obligations alone. The hurricane passed without causing major damage to Miami, but the experience had shaken Isabella. She had never seen Marco so stressed and distracted, and she began to notice small inconsistencies in his behavior. When he answered his phone, he sometimes seemed to forget which identity he was supposed to be projecting. He would start to speak in English before switching to Spanish, or he would begin telling a story about New York before catching himself and changing the details to fit his Miami persona. Meanwhile, in Brooklyn, Rebecca was dealing with her own concerns. Daniel had been asking increasingly pointed questions about his father's work. At 13, he was old enough to research Marcus's supposed employer online, and had discovered that the company's website did not list Marcus among its senior staff. When Rebecca called the company's main number to leave a message for Marcus, the receptionist seemed confused and said she would need to transfer the call to human resources. These small inconsistencies might have been overlooked individually, but they began to accumulate in both women's minds. Isabella started paying closer attention to Marco's phone calls, noticing that he sometimes stepped outside to take certain calls and spoke in hushed tones. Rebecca began tracking Marcus's travel more carefully. noting that his business trips to Miami were far more frequent than his trips to other cities. The breaking point came in early October, when both families decided to take spontaneous trips to Orlando. Rebecca had planned a surprise Disney World vacation for the boys' fall break, while Isabella had booked a long weekend at Disney with Sophia. Both women had tried to coordinate with Marcus's schedule, but he had been vague about his October travel plans. Marcus was in an impossible position. He could not be in Orlando with both families simultaneously, but he could not disappoint either group without raising serious questions. He decided to tell Rebecca that his work obligations had intensified, and he could not join them for the Disney trip. Meanwhile, he planned to spend the weekend in Orlando with Isabella and Sophia, hoping that the two families would not cross paths in the massive theme park. What Marcus had not anticipated was that both families would stay at the same Disney Resort hotel. Rebecca had chosen the Grand Floridian based on Marcus's previous recommendation, not knowing that he had recommended it because it was where he had stayed with Isabella and Sophia the previous year. On Friday afternoon, Rebecca was checking into the Grand Floridian with Daniel and Christopher when she saw a familiar figure across the lobby. The man looked exactly like Marcus, but he was speaking Spanish to a beautiful woman and a young girl. Rebecca's first instinct was to approach him, but something held her back. The man's body language, his clothing, even his posture seemed different from her husband's. Rebecca watched from a distance as the man who looked like Marcus kissed the woman passionately and lifted the little girl high in the air. The scene was so intimate and familial that Rebecca felt like she was intruding on a private moment. But the resemblance was uncanny. The man had Marcus's build, his distinctive scar above his left eyebrow, and his characteristic way of running his hand through his hair when he was thinking. Rebecca's mind raced with possible explanations. Perhaps Marcus had a twin brother he had never mentioned. Perhaps this was a distant cousin or relative. Perhaps she was simply seeing what she wanted to see, because she missed her husband. But as she continued to watch, the similarities became impossible to ignore. The woman called the man Marco as they headed toward the elevators, and Rebecca felt her stomach drop. She stood frozen in the lobby as the elevator doors closed, carrying away what appeared to be her husband with another family. Meanwhile, Marcus was completely unaware that Rebecca had seen him. He was focused on making Isabella and Sophia happy, trying to push aside his guilt about disappointing his New York family. He had become so accustomed to compartmentalizing his two lives that he felt safe in Orlando, far from both of his home bases. But Rebecca was not the type of person to ignore what she had seen. That evening, after putting the boys to bed, she sat in her hotel room and tried to make sense of what had happened. She called Marcus's phone repeatedly, but he did not answer. She tried his work number, but it went straight to voicemail. She even called the hotel in São Paulo where he was supposedly staying, only to be told that no one by that name was registered. Rebecca spent the night pacing her hotel room, her mind cycling through possibilities. By morning, she had convinced herself that she needed to find the man who looked like Marcus and confront him directly. She would either discover that it was a case of mistaken identity, or she would uncover the truth about what was happening to her marriage. The collision of Marcus's two worlds was now inevitable, and the carefully constructed life he had built was about to collapse around him. Saturday morning at the Grand Floridian Resort would become the day that changed 3 lives forever. Rebecca had spent the night planning her approach, while Marcus continued his weekend getaway with Isabella and Sophia, completely unaware that his two worlds were about to collide in the most devastating way possible. Rebecca had developed a simple plan. She would approach the man she believed to be Marcus while his family was distracted, perhaps at the pool or during breakfast. She would simply say hello and see how he reacted. If it was indeed Marcus, his response would tell her everything she needed to know. The opportunity came sooner than expected. Rebecca was having breakfast with Daniel and Christopher in the hotel restaurant when she spotted Marcus sitting 3 tables away with Isabella and Sophia. He was wearing a casual linen shirt and speaking animatedly in Spanish, gesturing with his hands in a way that seemed foreign to Rebecca. This was not the reserved, analytical man she had married. This was someone else entirely. Rebecca's hands trembled as she watched Marcus cut up pancakes for the little girl while chatting with the woman beside him. The intimacy between them was unmistakable. This was not a business associate or distant relative. This was a man with his family, comfortable and completely at ease in a way that looked exactly like the mornings Rebecca had shared with him in their Brooklyn kitchen. Unable to contain herself any longer, Rebecca stood up and walked directly to Marcus's table. The confrontation that followed would haunt all three families for years to come. "Marcus?" Rebecca said quietly, stopping beside his chair. The effect was immediate and devastating. Marcus's face went completely white, his fork clattering to his plate as he looked up at his Brooklyn wife. Isabella looked confused, glancing between Rebecca and the man she knew as Marco. Little Sophia continued eating her pancakes, oblivious to the adult drama unfolding around her. "I am sorry," Isabella said, in accented English, "but I think you have mistaken my husband for someone else. This is Marco Rivera." Rebecca's eyes never left Marcus's face. She watched as he struggled to find words, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly. The man who had always been so articulate, so confident, was completely frozen. "No," Rebecca said slowly. "This is Marcus Thompson, my husband, the father of my children." The words hit Isabella like a physical blow. She stared at Marcus, searching his face for some sign that this was a mistake, some indication that he would explain away this impossible situation. But Marcus's expression told her everything she needed to know. The guilt, the panic, the complete inability to deny what Rebecca had said, confirmed her worst fears. "Marco," Isabella whispered, her voice breaking. "What is she talking about?" Marcus finally found his voice, but the words that came out were not the explanations or denials that either woman expected. Instead, he said the most devastating thing possible: "I can explain everything." The admission hung in the air between them. In those 4 words, Marcus had confirmed Rebecca's suspicions and destroyed Isabella's world. Both women stared at him, waiting for an explanation that could somehow make sense of the impossible. But Marcus had no explanation that could repair the damage he had caused. For 10 years, he had lived a lie so complex that even he sometimes lost track of which version of the truth he was supposed to be telling. Now faced with both of his wives in the same room, he realized that his carefully constructed world was collapsing around him. Isabella stood up abruptly, scooping Sophia into her arms. The little girl began to cry, sensing her mother's distress without understanding the cause. "You are married?" Isabella asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "You have children?" Marcus nodded, unable to meet her eyes. The simple gesture confirmed what Rebecca had been afraid to believe, and what Isabella had been trying to deny. "How long?" Rebecca asked, her voice surprisingly calm despite the chaos in her mind. 6 years, Marcus whispered. The number hit both women with devastating force. 6 years meant that Marcus had married Isabella while still married to Rebecca. 6 years meant that Sophia had been born into a family built on lies. 6 years meant that everything Rebecca thought she knew about her marriage was false. Rebecca felt the ground shifting beneath her feet as she tried to process the magnitude of Marcus's betrayal. This was not an affair or a momentary lapse in judgment. This was a complete double life, a level of deception that seemed almost impossible to maintain. Isabella's mind was racing through memories, re-examining every moment of her relationship with Marco through this new lens. His frequent business trips, his reluctance to discuss his work in detail, his insistence on keeping their finances separate, all of it suddenly made terrible sense. "I have to go," Isabella said, still holding Sophia tightly. She looked at Rebecca with a mixture of sympathy and shared devastation. "I am so sorry. I did not know. I would never have." "I know," Rebecca said quietly. "Neither of us knew." As Isabella hurried away with Sophia, Rebecca was left alone with Marcus in the crowded restaurant. Other diners had begun to notice the commotion, but Rebecca felt completely isolated, as if she and Marcus were the only 2 people in the world. "How?" was all she could manage to say. Marcus began to speak, his words tumbling out in a desperate attempt to explain the unexplainable. He told Rebecca about the gradual development of his Marco Rivera identity, about his genuine love for both families, about his belief that he could make everyone happy by living 2 lives. But as Marcus spoke, Rebecca realized that the man she had loved for 12 years was essentially a stranger. The Marcus she had married was only half of who he really was, and that other half had been living a completely separate life with another woman and child. The most devastating revelation was yet to come. As Rebecca pressed Marcus for details, she learned that Isabella was not just his wife in Miami, she was his legal wife. Marcus had never divorced Rebecca, making his marriage to Isabella invalid, but he had convinced Isabella that their relationship was legitimate, while maintaining his legal marriage to Rebecca. The web of lies was so complex that even Marcus struggled to explain it coherently. He had created false identities, forged documents, and constructed elaborate financial arrangements to support both families. He had lied to employers, friends, and family members. He had betrayed not just 2 women, but 3 innocent children, who had grown up loving a father who was essentially a fiction. As the full scope of Marcus's deception became clear, Rebecca realized that her entire adult life had been based on a lie. Everything she believed about her marriage, her family, and her future was suddenly in question. The man sitting across from her was not the person she had promised to love and honor. He was a stranger who had stolen 12 years of her life. The massacre that Marcus had created was not one of violence, but of trust, love, and faith. He had destroyed 2 families not with weapons, but with lies. The devastation he had caused would ripple through the lives of everyone who had loved him, leaving scars that might never fully heal. The aftermath of that devastating morning in Orlando would test the strength and resilience of 2 remarkable women and 3 innocent children. But sometimes, the most profound healing comes from the most devastating betrayals, and both Rebecca and Isabella would discover reserves of strength they never knew they possessed. The immediate aftermath was chaos. Rebecca flew back to New York with Daniel and Christopher, her mind reeling as she tried to figure out how to explain to her 13-year-old sons that their father was not who they thought he was. Isabella returned to Miami with Sophia, facing the equally daunting task of rebuilding her life as a single mother, while processing the magnitude of the deception she had lived with for 6 years. Marcus found himself completely alone for the first time in over a decade. Both families had cut off contact with him, and he was forced to confront the reality of what he had done. The elaborate system he had built to maintain 2 lives collapsed almost instantly once the truth was revealed. His employers at both companies quickly discovered the fraud and terminated his employment. His carefully constructed identities began to unravel as investigators looked into his financial arrangements and legal status. But the real reckoning was not legal or financial. It was emotional. Marcus had to face the fact that his actions had devastated the people he claimed to love most. Daniel and Christopher were struggling to understand how their father could have lived such an elaborate lie. Sophia was confused about why her pappy had suddenly disappeared from her life. Rebecca and Isabella were both grappling with the realization that their marriages had been built on foundations of deception. The path to healing began with an unexpected connection between Rebecca and Isabella. 3 weeks after the confrontation in Orlando, Isabella called Rebecca. The conversation was awkward at first, but both women quickly realized that they were the only people who could truly understand what the other was going through. "I keep thinking about all the signs I missed," Isabella said during their first phone call. "All the times Marco seemed like a different person, all the questions I never asked." "I do the same thing," Rebecca replied. "I replay conversations in my head, looking for clues I should have seen. But I think that is exactly what he was counting on, that we would trust him completely." Over the following months, Rebecca and Isabella developed an unlikely friendship built on shared experience and mutual support. They compared notes about Marcus's behavior, helping each other identify the patterns and inconsistencies they had both unconsciously noticed but never questioned. They shared strategies for helping their children cope with the loss of the father they thought they knew. The children proved to be more resilient than either woman had expected. Daniel and Christopher were angry and confused, but they still had each other and their mother. Rebecca arranged for family counseling, and slowly, the boys began to process their father's betrayal. They learned that his lies did not diminish the love he had genuinely felt for them, even if that love had been expressed in the context of a fundamentally dishonest relationship. Sophia's healing was more complex because of her age, but Isabella handled it with remarkable grace. She explained to her 4-year-old daughter that sometimes grown-ups make very bad choices that hurt the people they love. She assured Sophia that her pappy had loved her very much, but that he had done something that meant he could not be part of their family anymore. Both women made the difficult decision to rebuild their lives completely. Rebecca left Brooklyn and moved to a smaller town in upstate New York, where she could start fresh. With Daniel and Christopher, she found work at a rural hospital and slowly began to rediscover who she was outside of her marriage to Marcus. Isabella decided to stay in Miami, but moved to a different neighborhood, away from the memories of her life. With Marco, she returned to teaching dance, eventually opening her own studio. The physical expression of movement and music helped her process her emotions and rebuild her sense of self. The most remarkable aspect of both women's recovery was their decision to maintain their friendship. Rebecca and Isabella became each other's strongest supporters, checking in regularly and celebrating each other's victories. Their children, who were technically half-siblings, developed a relationship through video calls and occasional visits. Daniel and Christopher were curious about their half-sister Sophia, and Isabella welcomed their interest. The children had done nothing wrong and deserved to know each other if they wanted to. Over time, the three children formed a bond that transcended the chaos their father had created. Rebecca eventually returned to dating, but she approached new relationships with hard-won wisdom about the importance of transparency and trust. She learned to pay attention to inconsistencies and to ask difficult questions. When she met David, a widowed teacher who had moved to her town, she was completely honest about her past and her children's complicated family situation. David's acceptance and understanding helped Rebecca believe in love again. Isabella's healing took a different path. She focused on building her dance studio and creating a stable, joyful life for Sophia. She was not ready to trust another romantic partner, but she found fulfillment in her work, her daughter, and her friendship with Rebecca. She learned to celebrate her own strength and independence. Both women eventually found ways to forgive Marcus. Not because he deserved it, but because holding on to anger was preventing them from moving forward. They realized that Marcus had been living in his own prison of lies and deception, and that his actions had ultimately destroyed his own life as much as theirs. The legal consequences for Marcus were significant but not devastating. He faced fraud charges related to his false identity and financial arrangements, but prosecutors were more interested in restitution than punishment. He was required to pay back money he had fraudulently obtained and to provide financial support for all three of his children. Marcus eventually moved to a different state and took a job in a field completely unrelated to finance or real estate. He maintained minimal contact with his children through supervised visits and support payments, but he had lost the right to be part of their daily lives. The elaborate, exciting life he had built collapsed into a simple, solitary existence focused on making amends for the damage he had caused. The most profound lesson that emerged from this devastating situation was the incredible resilience of the human spirit. Rebecca, Isabella, Daniel, Christopher, and Sophia had all survived what felt like the complete destruction of their family structures. But rather than being destroyed by Marcus's betrayal, they had been transformed by it. They learned that love is not diminished by being shared honestly, but it is corrupted by deception. They discovered that trust, once broken, can be rebuilt, but only through consistent honesty and transparency. They found that families are not defined by the biological or legal connections between people, but by the genuine care and support they provide for each other. Rebecca often reflected on how much stronger she had become through surviving Marcus's deception. She had learned to trust her instincts to ask difficult questions and to build relationships based on authentic connection rather than comfortable assumptions. Isabella had discovered that she was capable of creating a beautiful life for herself and her daughter without depending on anyone else for validation or security. The children, too, had learned valuable lessons about the complexity of human nature and the importance of honesty in relationships. They understood that people could love genuinely while still making terrible choices, and that forgiveness was possible even when trust had been completely destroyed. As the years passed, the acute pain of Marcus's betrayal faded into a deeper understanding of human frailty and resilience. Rebecca and Isabella both found ways to tell their story that emphasized growth and healing rather than victimization and anger. They became advocates for other women who had experienced similar betrayals, offering support and guidance based on their own experiences. The friendship between Rebecca and Isabella became a source of strength that extended far beyond their shared experience with Marcus. They supported each other through career changes, parenting challenges, and new relationships. Their children grew up knowing that they were part of an extended family built not on biology or law, but on choice and commitment. If you have been touched by this story of deception, betrayal, and ultimate healing, I encourage you to share it with others who might need to hear this message of hope. Sometimes the most devastating experiences in our lives become the foundation for the most profound growth and transformation. The human capacity for resilience, forgiveness, and love is far greater than we imagine, and even the most carefully constructed lies cannot ultimately destroy the truth of who we are meant to become. The massacre that Marcus created was indeed devastating, but it was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of two women's journey toward authentic strength, genuine connection, and the kind of love that can only emerge from complete honesty and transparency. Their story reminds us that sometimes we must lose everything we thought we wanted in order to discover everything we actually need.